So let's start with Dorcas. So I think Dorcas, just to start off with, for the sake of those that don't know you, please can I ask you to just introduce yourself for a few seconds?
Thank you. Thanks all for having me. And of course, it's such a pleasure to be with all of you on this call to discuss such an important matter from various perspectives. So my name is Dorcas Onyango. I am a Kenyan living in South Africa. I work in development and external affairs. I have a huge passion for eradicating poverty in Africa and across the world. And so I'm privileged at the moment to represent Coca-Cola in their work in sustainability, which in many aspects focuses on improving our social impact.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Dorcas. So I think we all know that basically women have been disproportionately affected by the COVID pandemic. And I think what's particularly interesting is your affiliation with Coca-Cola. So how exactly have the women in Coca-Cola been affected by the pandemic?
Well, firstly, I think the whole world has been affected, but I think women have been disproportionately negatively affected. In Coca-Cola specifically, we have a lot of working mothers. We have a very gender balanced workforce. So of course, with everybody going back home, as you know, in employment, as you know, at home and in many African societies and even in other countries, women are the primary caregiver at home. They do a lot more to care for the children, to help the children go through school. And so that can cause an additional layer of strain because then they have to juggle their day-to-day work with, as everybody else would, with their home care duties. And that's not always easy, particularly for single mothers.
Yeah, so I think we've seen it again with climate change, how they've been disproportionately affected by that because of the role that they play in society. And we're seeing it again in COVID. So why do you think then it's important to put a gender lens to understanding this impact of the pandemic on them?
So the pandemic has both social and economic issues. And there's no social and economic advancement in this world without gender equality. So that's on a very general level. So we've got to look at women and look at men and how they are impacted differently. Already before the pandemic, there was a huge gender imbalance, and that caused a lot of, or comes with a lot of issues. And what the pandemic has done is just made those issues worse. So let's go into some examples. Let's look at health. Women are caregivers. We know that most males are more affected and are losing their lives more than women, but women are affected because then they're caregivers. So their attention is split. The second piece is, should they lose their husbands? There's a loss of income in the family. And the woman has to pick up for two people in addition to her normal job or her normal occupation, be it farming and caring for the family. Now she has an expanded role with less income. Back to health as well, most of the frontline health workers in many countries across the world are women. So they're working harder and they're exposed. So net for me, I think women are working day and night in the face of the pandemic. And then they're affected and they're likely to be exposed and infected. So a really challenging situation for women. That's if you only take a health lens. But if you take a gender lens and look at other sectors, let's look at education. I've talked about employment with the example of Coca-Cola. Let's look at education. Majority of teachers are women. Again, having to school online, and they have their own school their children online and school other people's children online. That's not easy for anybody to manage. I mean, just look at us and what working on Zoom and offline would have done to us. Imagine a woman with children. But also the exposure for those who've decided to go back and teach. And then in many instances, if we go to the economics, women have the kind of roles that are either in secure jobs or non-permanent jobs. So what does that mean? They don't have the social protection that many of us have or men have. And so they may not have health insurance. And similarly, they may not have unemployment funds. So what we are facing here is a huge possibility and likelihood that the gains that the world have made in terms of gender equality and women advancement are probably going to be cycling backwards. And if you double click and look at young girls, many of them may never go back to school because they're sent home, they're expected to do house chores. In many instances of family where there's that one computer where online learning might happen. We all know from African societies, the boy child is likely to have that computer, or he has the strength and the access to go and seek for those opportunities outside the home. Not the same for a girl child. So dropping out of school is a huge possibility. And then one where we've seen the whole world, and this is extremely concerning, is gender-based violence. Across the world, there's been increased reporting of women bearing the brunt of the pressure of men being constrained because of, social distancing and other pressures that have come with the disease. So yes, the problem that women are facing is insurmountable.
I want to pose, or rather ask you to speak to a different sector, agriculture, which, we of course, we're broadcasting this recording to a lot of people from that sector, and with the understanding that most of the people that grow our food, the farmers, small-scale farmers particularly, are women. What in your work on the continent particularly have you seen, not just how COVID has impacted women and farmers generally, but what challenges and opportunities present for the continent, for us to think differently, for us to respond differently to how we grow food, how we build equitable systems, inclusive systems. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that women in agriculture are not in any better situation. In fact, when we say that women are working from home, working harder, working 24 hours, subsistence farmers or women in farming are even more affected. First of all, 70% of the food globally is grown by women, and they're not paid enough for that, for what they do. Now, supply chains have broken down and markets have shifted. So the pipeline for women to continue to advance and earn more or receive empowerment in terms of advancing their farming capabilities has been diminished, because with supply chains broken, what does that mean? Is that either women are sitting with produce that's not getting to the market, so their income has been reduced, or what we will see, because the disease has had a huge impact in terms of government spending or donor funding, is as people shift their funding, women are likely to suffer in agriculture if funding shifts in terms of fertilizer or farmer empowerment, farmer productivity. And then, like I said, the burden at home and caregiving has increased for them. So what does that mean? That going to the farm when you have a sick patient at home or when you're not earning is even more difficult and challenging. So I think women in agriculture are facing this situation in an even worse situation, because in many instances, they don't have a voice and somebody talking for them. The specific challenges they may be facing as small subsistence farmers who are trying to feed their families are probably not even spoken for or identified. And so it will be upon governments, ourselves, both from a policy response or just sectorial response, to be particularly and deliberate about trying to understand what farmers, particularly women farmers, are going to face. More than ever, they're going to be abused in the farm if gender-based violence is happening. They're having to go fetch water. Maybe the opportunity to receive water from other means has now diminished as funds are being redirected to health. So women are forced to really make tough choices.
Another sector that strikes me that women have been really affected is the hospitality industry. I think if you have a look at the tourism industry, it employs, in terms of the people within just a lodge, whatever, majority of those are women. In many cases in rural areas, it was the one opportunity for consistent income to earn a wage. I think, the impact of the shutdown, of lack of tourists, is really, I think, impacted on those communities badly, and women's status within the family as a money earner.
Absolutely. As soon as women stop earning, their status in the family changes. And, when you talk about different sectors, think about domestic workers. Many of them instantly, overnight, had to choose between being with their children or being with their employer. A really tough decision for them to make. And so they're at home probably not earning with no social protection. So you're right, Steve. If you look at the sectors, you could go on and on.
Yeah. And Dorcas, I know you have a particularly interesting perspective, being that when you put on your Coca-Cola cap, you work with WWF, and we have Samir on the call, who's head of the catchment water source areas, and I know you guys have, the organizations have worked together there in terms of water security, and particularly your supply chains. Coca-Cola is dependent on water for your commodities, and we have Peter as well, you know, who's doing his amazing work in renewable energy with farmers using waste. You made reference of, you know, food wastage on farm. He's got some solutions that he's working on there. I know in East and Central Africa, Coca-Cola is working with players like Peter. So I just want you to help us connect those dots in terms of security, and on the continent. We tend to think in terms of regions, south and east, you know, central and north and west. How is this forcing us to think differently, this moment, to think differently about this nexus? You've spoken of health, you've spoken of education, you layer on climate change and issues like displacement that you see in Sudan and Uganda, and it's a different kind of, you know, can of fish that we're dealing with. So I'd like you to give us a perspective there in terms of what you've seen and how perhaps Coca-Cola is thinking about sustainability in that sense. What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think, so first of all, as I started, I said everybody's affected, including corporates. So corporates are really having to refocus to survive, because for us, for example, hospitality, huge customer base for Coca-Cola in hospitality, hotels, restaurants, bars. And so that was a huge loss of business. And we've always seen that as an opportunity to empower women. The best way to empower women is put them in a position where they're earning. So for us, we're really concerned about the job losses that are happening in hospitality. But water, as you've mentioned, also is a huge area of concern that we've always played in from a social and environmental perspective. Water, as the WHO has indicated, and hand washing is the first and fundamental access that everybody needs across the day, several times a day. We have a lot of programs to support water access, and we will continue on that. We've just met our goal and supported 6 million people across Africa. Now more than ever, we are beginning to think about putting a gender-based lens to our interventions as we seek to scale or to continue the work that we are doing. So we may be looking at areas in which we are very deliberate in terms of empowering women through water. And I think we will continue to advocate for small businesses to open. So from a commercial element, you will see that in Kenya, for example, we've launched a campaign called Open Like Never Before. What that campaign is we've put in 125 million Kenya shillings to keep small businesses open. And majority of those small businesses are eateries, dukas, run by women. So we are going back to how are we running our business with women as part of that value chain catered for. And by focusing on our own trade, we are focusing on women. Part of that campaign is not just our own investment, but we are asking other partners, do what you can. So you might have seen that we work with the Women Enterprise Fund in Kenya, and we've been talking about how do we facilitate interest-free loans for women, because with people staying at home, what has essentially happened is they've lost the foot traffic and they've lost the sales in dukas, not just in restaurants and bars. And so we're advocating for government to look at policy and directives differently. Yes, we may need lockdowns, but if we can support dukas to keep open by providing PPEs, of providing them with training to make sure that they meet government guidelines, then we can sustain their livelihoods. You might have seen we did a lot of work around hand washing. In many instances, you will make a change through women and children. So they're really part of the target. We are working with banks such as ABSA. In instances where the women cannot access free loans, how can they reduce the barriers that it takes for their credit rating so they can access working capital and keep their businesses running, particularly now that every business is bleeding. So the likelihood that businesses will be giving out of, they're probably going to default back to running the business, which is what a lot of governments asked us. If you can keep your businesses running, you can keep employment. If you can keep employment, you can keep the economy. And then the likelihood of women benefiting is probably going to happen. So I think my advice there is everybody must keep doing what they're supposed to be doing to the extent that they can, but you cannot be gender neutral in your approach. Be it policy or other direct interventions, you've got to take a female lens onto it.
Steve, I wanna get your perspective here in terms of what you have seen since the last time we spoke about a year ago with all issues sustainability and resilience. I know you're doing a lot of work around water and some touch points that Dorcas referred to. So first of all, just for people who don't know who you are, just to introduce yourself and give us a perspective.
Sure, thanks. I am currently working for a USAID program called Resilient Waters. It's a USAID Southern Africa SADC program. So we're working in the Okavango and Limpopo River basins, as well as the transfrontier conservation areas, Kaza and Greater Limpopo. And our focus is on improving the decision-making and those transboundary institutions. Dealing with WASH issues, so water, sanitation, and health is a key bit of our work. Then the work that I'm dealing with is livelihoods and climate adaptation, and then we've got a biodiversity focus as well. And so we try and work at the intersection between the biodiversity, livelihoods, water, and sometimes then obviously the issues of energy that I think Peter will talk about later. So I think the lockdown and COVID has really impacted, I think, the conservation model and the community benefit model around conservation has been built around tourism. And I think over the last 10, 15 years throughout SADC and East Africa, communities have been rewarding good land stewardship by getting involved in the tourism industry and having partnerships with the private sector where they pay a lease for the use of the land, employing local people, etc. Obviously now with COVID, a lot of those jobs are now lost, unfortunately. And all the small businesses that would support those industries, be they dealing with waste from a lodge or be it supply, laundry, all those have been impacted on. I think one of the other interesting things we've observed is that with some of the lockdowns, like in South Africa, where cigarettes were not allowed to be sold, we saw people move away from poaching and moving cigarettes across the Limpopo River while it's dry. So, you know, I think some people have seen some opportunities even within this. It's a lot less risky than poaching, obviously. We have unfortunately seen some instances people poaching not for ivory or trade or whatever, but for food, basic access to protein, because they've lost now any kind of maybe some income that they had. I think it's created a bit more of a reality check in terms of what is a rural development model. And I think people are much more now looking at the one asset that people have control of is their land. You had no control over your job because if you was somebody else, you lost that job. There goes your asset. But if you have land and if you work it well, if you have access to water, and I think these are the skills that women in particular do have, you know, and I think if we can find ways in which we use their rights to land, we give them access to information, to markets, to information on how to farm, on how to do things better, I think we will see a very quick uptake, because I think people are not seeing the solution in the rural areas anymore. I think we've seen some areas people are moving back to rural areas because at least there they can feed themselves and their families. And I think that that's a whole switch that we're going to have to accommodate in future.
But we've seen a lot of people moving from for the exact same reason that you highlighted, Steve, of control. of the means of production, for livelihood, for sustenance, for incomes. And I wanna invite Samir into the conversation to speak to water specifically, because you see a lot of contestation, Steve, around water source areas, and I mean, in the work that we've done in the past decade, there's been this doom and gloom conversation about the next major conflict is going to be around water, because we I mean, Southern Africans live in a fairly arid area, right? So Samir, what's your take on this? I know WWF does a lot of work around the journey of water along from the source to the tap, and this misconception that water comes from the tap. Talk to us about that, and connect some of these dots that Steve has alluded to. But please also, you know, for the people that don't know you, introduce yourself first.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. My name is Samir Andera Rees. I manage the Water Source Areas program at WWF South Africa. So my focus is on improving the protection and the management of the strategic water source areas, which are the mountain catchment regions where South Africa and Lesotho and Swaziland get most of our water from. They make up 10% of the area of those three countries, but provide 50% of our surface water runoff. And they also have high overlap with highly biodiverse landscapes. They are the areas where our rivers start. They are the sort of beating heart of our water system. And as a result, those are the areas where a lot of our dams are built. And because we have high reliance on surface water in this country for our water supply, that's where most of our economic centers get their water from. So these areas, they support 50% of our population, 64% of our economy, and 70% of our irrigated agriculture. So my focus is on making sure those areas are better protected, better managed, and restored to a functioning state. So with that said, yeah, I think that there are some very interesting themes coming out here. And it reminds me of actually a documentary that I watched last night, David Attenborough's documentary, Life on Our Planet. And he starts off, I thought, in a very interesting way, where he starts off in Chernobyl, and he talks about how this was a catastrophe like the world had never seen. And everyone took note of just how bad this was, but it happened overnight. And that's why people took note of it, because it was almost an instantaneous impact. And then he says, you know, it meant that life could no longer be supported, or human life could no longer be supported in this area. But when you look at biodiversity loss and climate change, the same thing is happening to our world. It's just happening over a longer time period. So the increments are much smaller, and it's harder to see that we are working our way towards a point where life perhaps can't support, and the planet cannot continue to support life, and particularly the type of life that we enjoy as humanity right now. And I think that something very similar has happened with COVID-19, that this was an almost overnight impact for many of us. You know, we heard this rumor of this virus starting in China, and then none of us really realized, like, ever expected that it would come to us. But then next thing we know, countries are shutting down left, right, and center, and suddenly we're stuck in our homes. And what it really made me realize is that our systems and our society are far less resilient than any of us ever expected. And I think that this concept of resilience now is going to gain a lot more traction. You know, we talk about resilience to climate change in the environmental sector, but I think that now that people have seen just how easy it is for everything to fall apart, I think that there's going to be more interest in making sure that our systems and our economies and our societies are more resilient to the shocks that are surely coming with biodiversity loss and climate change. And I think that one thing that's been very interesting is, Steve spoke about this, and you also spoke about this sort of movement of people from the urban areas to the rural areas. And what's really interesting about that is that nature has proved itself to be our social safety net. That people can return to the land and still have things to eat, still have water, still have energy. In economies that don't have those sort of social safety nets that are built in by the government, nature and land is our social safety net. And we've sort of recognized that. And we've also recognized that we can't speak only about the environment without thinking about people's fundamental human needs. That those two things are intimately interlinked, especially in landscapes where people have such an intimate relationship with nature. And if we're going to talk about improving the water security of the country and releasing more water and better quality water out of these areas, it can't work unless you are talking at the same time about how the people that live in those landscapes and the people that are responsible for managing the water resources are able to access that water. So if they can't access good quality water and enough water, then there's no way that they're going to care enough about the issues of people far away and downstream to actually act on them. People are going to look after their fundamental human needs first and foremost. So that's one of the things that we've recognized. We recognized in the water source areas that the built infrastructure that is meant to provide people with some of the basic resources that they need, like water, are just not working. And that goes doubly so for times of COVID, when people were not maintaining the boreholes. They weren't providing the diesel needed to pump the generator, the pumps to pump the water out of those boreholes. And I'm sure that with the economic crunch that's coming, there's going to be less and less money available for infrastructure development, for maintenance, for running the infrastructure. And people are going to have to rely more and more on the natural resources at their disposal. And for us, those natural resources in the areas that we're talking about are natural springs, where water just flows out of the ground and is available, good quality water is available for people to use. Unfortunately, in the areas where we work, many of those springs were unprotected. People were sharing the spring points with livestock, which meant that they were susceptible to contamination. There were invasive alien trees growing all around them, which meant that the spring flow was being reduced, particularly in the low season. So, and it's a pity Dorcas isn't here, because we started this project with Coca-Cola where we protected 5 of these springs, and we cleared the landscape of alien trees in the supply areas for the springs. We also started to recognize that things like waste removal are a huge issue, and that people were dumping nappies or diapers in areas above the springs, which meant that the water quality was being affected. So we started to realize that all these interplays between the natural environments and people's basic human needs. And we've now expanded this project. We started off with protecting 5 springs, but we've expanded this to protecting 24 springs through a new project. And this is part of taking care of people's basic human needs, taking care of people's hygiene. And I think that, by taking care of people's human needs, we also link it to the greater landscape, and the health of the landscape is linked to the health of the people. And that, I think, is a concept that we need to drive forward as conservationists.
The health of the landscape is interlinked to the health of people. I think that's a nuanced statement, isn't it? Given where we are in this moment right now. And I'm thinking, as if because Solidaridad works with farmers primarily across the globe, I'm thinking, if I'm a farmer in rural Africa somewhere, and I'm affected by climate change, and my land is becoming more and more infertile. And there's a forest close by in my backyard. And I start cutting down trees to make charcoal, to sell that charcoal so I can have an income. And you see this at scale, for instance, in Zambia or Mozambique or Malawi, where annually close to 500,000 hectares is decimated, or forest is decimated, because we burn up our forest in order to use that's our energy source. To kind of hiking back to the conversation we had about a year ago. So I'm that farmer, and I'm thinking, survival. This story of resilience really doesn't really apply to me. I'm trying to adapt here. So are we focusing our efforts, adaptation, mitigation wise, at the wrong kind of solutions? Is the question that's in my head right now, listening to you, Samir, and there's pressures on our landscapes, and it's a kind of new way of thinking, isn't it? That we have to look at a landscape approach of who are the players that are engaged in a landscape, from farmers to miners to industry, and all these other people, and tourism products and so on. It's a fundamentally kind of different view from just, you have the pristine spaces that need to be protected, and right next to them you have people that are trying to survive. And when those two things interact, then you have breakouts of pandemic like COVID, for instance. So I want to throw that back at you, to unpack this landscape bit, a bit more, and of course, Steve, Peter, feel free to join into that conversation, because I know your work also touches on that.
Yeah, so I think that in an ideal world, right, we should be, you often hear people talking about, yes, we need, precision agriculture in Africa. We need, that every person in Africa has access to tapped water in their house. But if you look at the gap between our ideal world and where we currently are, it's so vast. And sometimes I feel like maybe we need to look at, first and foremost, protecting what's there and working with the way that people know how to work. Before we start saying, let's fly some drones over farmland in Africa, let's make sure that people have water on their farmlands. Let's make sure they have access to seeds and fertilizer, and have good access to markets, decent infrastructure to get their produce to markets. Let's make sure that people, the water access that they already have, let's make sure that is good and adequate before we start saying, let's build huge infrastructure and get people tapped water into their houses. And maybe that's a bit of a fatalistic way of seeing it, but in a time of COVID, with the economic impacts that we're seeing, with the crunch that's going to come on spending and the shifting in funding, I think that fundamentally we need to find the solutions that are locally appropriate first and foremost, before we start saying let's go for these high tech, let's disrupt the industry with X, Y, and Z. Let's work with what people already have and take care of that first and foremost before we go with some super high tech solution. That's my opinion anyway. And I think, as I said, natural resources are the safety net that we're talking about here. We need to protect the soil, we need to protect the water, we need to protect the forests from over-exploitation and destruction, and particularly at a time when we sit on I think that COVID has created a kind of a knife edge that we sit on, where on the one side, we could fall and it could be, development at all costs. Let's just get whatever we can right now. We need to we need to take care of our needs. On the other hand, we're saying, I think that society has been in a form of inertia. We've been running full steam ahead along a certain development path. And even though some people are sort of trying to say, guys, we need to rethink this, because society has been so fixed on this one form of development, it's been very difficult to shift our path. I think that COVID presents us an opportunity to say, our inertia has been broken. We all sat inside for 2 months. It gave us a time to think. It gave us a time to reflect on how we do things. It also gave us a time to look at the systems that we've got and whether they are adequate for the future we want to see. And so on the other side of the knife edge is this idea of building back better, doing things in a way that is more environmentally friendly and more sustainable in the long run, so that we don't find ourselves with, crisis after crisis after crisis from this point forward.
I want to invite Peter in and Steve after him, because Peter, this idea that Samir is talking about of starting with what people have, low tech, I know you've embraced that with your work that you presented at the Sustainability Conference last year on Repal, on Sepal, these renewable energy startups that you run in Uganda. You being a rocket scientist, first of all, and using your knowledge at a very localized level with farmers, starting with what they have, using that principle. What has that looked like under COVID when you weren't able to move and make the interventions that you're planning to make? I remember the kind of plans you had to expand some of those projects into Kenya, for instance. So how is that going? And please expand on this idea of starting with what people have.
Thank you very much, Samir, and thank you, Mo. So basically, it is important, of course, to start with what people have, and that is on the natural resources side. Because unless they have land, unless they have water, unless they have human resource, we don't have much to work with. But now, so what we basically do in Uganda, where we're working at the moment, is to offer farmers access to training they need to optimize their yields based on the acreage they have, based on the crops they know how to work with. So we bring on board agricultural support officers to basically help them improve how they do everything from planting to throughout the cultivation cycle. When it comes down to figuring out what to do about the water, we give them the knowledge of the fact that they have a lot of husks and cobs and shells that could be crushed and plowed into the soil to make it hold more water. That that kind of allows the land, once the rain has fallen in, to remain with water for a bit longer, which helps improve the yields on that particular site. With regards to making the soil even more interesting and more nutrient rich, we work a lot on the biomass to energy side, where we take the majority of these husks and shells and cobs and we transform that into electricity. And what's left behind is a biochar, so which once again is a good fixer for the soil, where bacteria can basically grow, and it helps make the soil even more nutritious for the plants. So with husks and with the biochar that comes out of our power generation systems, as well as giving them stoves that can run on briquettes and pellets made from, because there's tons and tons of husk shells, and giving them gasifier stoves, so which allow them to cook with the methane gas coming up top, and still have biochar coming down at the bottom. They use some of that biochar in the soil once again. It's kind of that way, it's possible to bring very simple technology to help them make the most of what they currently have. Well, that's what we had been doing all along. Then COVID popped in and said hello, and now it's a case of saying, all right, great. Now we can no longer do physical trainings with the farmers. We can no longer gather them in town halls where we have 500 farmers in one place. But how do we reach out to them? Not every farmer has a smartphone, you know, and not every farmer has internet. So a lot of the work that we've been, you know, wanting to do on the high tech and digital side of things, it's been really tough. We've got to start from first principles and go, all right, great. You can improve access to electricity, improve access to internet, train people how to use smartphones, and go. So it's a lot of work. But now we don't really have a choice because of, you know, COVID is real, and as a result, rules and regulations have changed. We have to gather people in small groups now. So the opportunity that has come in once again, when you look at human resource which is available, that is students whose parents are farmers who haven't been going to school and have had to go home. There've been the opportunity now to have people who can use smartphones, because most kids know how to read and write, and, you know, can learn how to use smartphones quite quickly. So it's now allowed us to go and say, great, now, you know, let's let these boys and girls who are at home and can't go to school because schools are all closed, let them be the ones now having these smartphones and allowing us to, you know, continue with the work we were doing before, work of aggregation, the work of training, and so on and so forth. And that's been quite interesting. It's given us, so the resource in this case is human resource in terms of the students from universities, technical schools, and high schools that are back home with their parents. That has allowed us to now go, right, instead of working with just, you know, the farmers groups, we now have, you know, these young people who are very skilled, and it's opened up new avenues for us. And the same young people can also use these smartphones now to study as well. So it kind of adds that particular fact on it. But it's a gradual process which has kicked off in the areas where there is internet access. But from 2021, we will add additional internet hotspots, you know, and just kind of have Wi-Fi available there, where we work together with the internet providers and, you know, kind of cover that cost, because without that, we can't reach out to the community. Because if you're trying to reach 30,000 farmers and you can't go to them, you've got to find a way. So it's been quite interesting that way. Another water kind of segue from Samir as well, on the irrigation side, we've also gone and said, okay, what is available? Okay, there's a lot of rain, there's a bit of rainwater harvesting there and so on. But then at the same time, how can the farmers start getting involved in more high value crops that need more water, obviously, you know, passion fruit, vegetables, and so on. So irrigation comes in, and but we can't do high-tech irrigation. So we've got to do snazzy, low-tech irrigation, which helps, and that's basically bucket, you know, and a drum on the back of a truck, and the truck moves around. But the cool bit there is the truck is not a diesel truck or a petrol truck or a donkey cart. It is an electric vehicle. So that's kind of adding in that interesting, you know, angle of saying, you know, let's use tech to help people make the most of what they know how to do. So people that know how to ride tricycles, you know, so So same tricycle riders, convert them into electric tricycles instead. Put the buckets of water on the back of it and so on, and off it goes. So deliver it from door to door. So that's how we've been trying to basically do it. Go figure out some tech that can make people make the most of what they can actually do. But then I believe by the end of next year, once we get used to this, it will have ended up being an opportunity to pivot in a way we hadn't even dreamt of before.
Nice.
Now, when it comes to now aggregation, someone trusted no longer goes to pick the bag. Instead, it's put on a vehicle that is brought in. So now we've got to go one step further and and kind of go on the digital side and figure out more in-house. Really, the digital is more in-house to figure out whose crop is whose. When was it brought in, and and kind of so that when it has to go to Coca-Cola or others, it's which farmer brought it in, and the farmer is able to get the income. So it's
traceability.
Overall, it's been a year spent trying to figure it all out. We're glad things are moving forward now, and so 2021 looks finally exciting, at least with what we plan to do this year. I guess we'll do it next year now. Kenya is still an option. Southern Africa is very exciting now, especially some of the areas that Steve was talking about. It would be interesting to finally figure out how we can do that. But what's interesting is it enables us to work more with people on the ground, and work on more inclusive replication strategies, which looks at involving people on the ground based on what is available.
Yeah. Great stuff. Steve, I know you'll agree with Peter on tech issues, and Resilient Waters has been working a lot with trying to figure out how to deploy tech to assist not only around river management and access and protection and monitoring and all that cool stuff. But Peter also brings up an important issue of people on the ground. And as you know, in our continent, most of those people on the ground are young. It's the youth, which mostly women, but they're young. So how in your work are you guys thinking about this opportunity from a digital standpoint? Since we're all now working digitally, we're forced to think about interventions from a digital lens. But also, how do you empower young people to use that term to get interested in the work of sustainability, in the work of agriculture, modernizing our economies and so on? I know you've got a perspective from resilience, from the work that you've done across the continent, not only around water issues. Where does all these dots, where do they kind of connect for you?
Yeah, so I think for us, we see the digital world and as really a way to access tools, how to access information. We have created, I think, also ways for landscape level. Samir talked about the landscape level interventions. I think that's where you need to get to. We work with, there's a map of CASA, the Transfrontier Conservation Area. It's a huge area in 5 different countries where people have decided that a sustainable development route is going to include living with nature, not against nature. So once you start working at that level, you need to start accessing, I think, information at a global level. And by that I mean satellite-based information. And you can then tie it down to a local level. You can put meters into the river. So you can see what's happening now in terms of water flows, because what happens up the catchment impacts what happens down. Once you got people sitting around a room together, the 5 countries, they should be able to access that information in an easy way, not in a way that only scientists can understand with graphs, but they can start saying, okay, well, if, for example, we allow the development of a factory upstream that's going to extract so much water, what is the impact on the downstream users? And you can start bringing those downstream users into the conversation. And so the Biosphere Reserves, for example, we really like them, the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Reserves, because they at least start with an agreement around basic zonation and land use. And they have created an institution that needs to report regularly on what's happening. And it doesn't say only conservation, only economy, only livelihoods. It mixes it together, and it enables, at least you got that start. Now, how do you communicate with the people living in your area? So a website, get down to the basics of how do you create a proper website where if you live in the area, you can access information, you can report a problem. You see someone taking sand out the river, you've got somewhere to report it safely. You can take a photograph, you can upload it. How do you get young people involved in monitoring biodiversity change for good or bad? I think you can pay them, you can give them credits. If they had like an app that says, okay, I'm going to now report this alien invasion that I'm seeing over here, geo-referenced, reported to somebody. Similarly, we should be, enabling community environmental stewards, environmental monitors, rewarding them for that. But I think the question you asked is, how do you get those people interested? I think you get them interested by showing how it impacts on their own lives.
Wonderful. I want to pull in Nonsi into the conversation. Nonsi is with Solidaridad, and she kind of kicked off this conversation with Dorcas for that gender lens. And Nonsi has innovation in her title. And Nonsi, sorry to put you on the spot here. When we're talking about young people, you're one of those young people. And I just want to get from you, when you put on your Solidaridad cap, as a young person working in innovation, some of the digital innovations that you guys have been working on, like the dashboard, like Kivuno. Can you speak to us a bit about that? How Solidaridad is using tech and employing young people from soil testing to climate analysis, algorithms, and all sorts of cool stuff that you're doing over there. How are you guys thinking about this?
Cool. So I think maybe to start on and pick on a little bit of what Steve was saying about how do we incentivize people to sort of do good behavior. At Solidaridad, we sort of take the digital aspect of things very seriously. So I think one of the applications that we sort of put together is what we call Zawadi. And what that basically does is we incentivize the farmers that we work with, and we work with about 35,000 farmers across Southern Africa, and we incentivize them for climate smart agricultural practices. So what this looks like is, say for instance, they go for training and they're able to prove that they've used this training either in their fields or post-harvest. They then get points. And then when their points accumulate, they can then start to claim things. So for example, they can claim a free soil test, they can claim gumboots, which would help them obviously when they're farming. So that's how we've tried to sort of incentivize and to encourage farmers to be able to adopt good practices. So for now, we've got about 900 farmers that have got points, but there's a whole lot of other digital tools that we sort of rely on for the projects that we do. So I won't take you obviously through all of them, but maybe just for example, the one Mo spoke about, the soil testing. So what that basically does is looking from the beginning of the value chain. When we look at the farmers before they plant, we take soil tests, and we've done about last week, actually, we reached a milestone. We have about 3,000 soil tests across Southern Africa. And what this basically does is when we collect soil tests, and we use youth to do this, we can then tell you what nutrients are in the soil. So what level of phosphorus, what level of nitrogen, potassium, and then it also then recommends what you should grow given the soil that you have and what fertilizer to use, focusing on organic fertilizer, and at what stage of production this fertilizer needs to be applied. And then when the farmer sort of starts the journey, we have things like farming solution and business solution, which again is a digital solution. So this is right at the beginning of their farming journey again, and this basically helps them to run as entrepreneurs. So it basically equips them with accounting skills where they enter different various information, and it generates income statements for them, just to sort of increase that entrepreneurship that, within them. And then, for example, I'll talk about the cattle grading app. So maybe let's switch a little bit to livestock. So what this basically is we've given farmers cell phones where they can take pictures of the different cattle, the different angles of the cattle, and this basically will tell them the market value of their cattle. Now, not only is this a marketing tool, but it's also used for monitoring. So if there's a certain price that the farmer would like to get to for this particular livestock, they can use this app to monitor. So once they know that this is the price that I can fetch, they then go back and use the other tools to say, okay, what do I need to do? What good agricultural practices or what herding practices do I need to apply for me to be able to increase the price of my livestock? So I think also maybe on the dashboard, this sort of ties everything in. And this is basically saying, what sort of vulnerabilities are out there at different on different farms at farm level. So it's basically a dashboard where you go online and you can click and you can see, using a map, you can see anywhere in the world, you can see what vulnerabilities are there for women and men. And obviously this informs project design. So you know exactly what to be looking out for. But I think as a young person working in Solidaridad, I think throughout all of these particular applications, from the usage of them, from the designing of them, including the community. So for example, the cattle grading app, that was actually designed with the community and with young people as well. And then if we look across the livestock value chain and we look at the end of it to the leather, so we also have leather projects as well. We also incorporate youth there. So they've also been trained, and I think, yeah, so also working with Solidaridad, I think it highlights definitely from a gender perspective and also from a youth perspective. And maybe just to add that to date, at least 30% of the people that we work with, or the farmers that we work with, are women in certain projects. And I think last week as well, we reached 70% in one of our training programs of women. So it is something that we actively seek to do and something that we're currently working on.
On the livestock, I think one of the realizations that we talked about, people going back to rural areas. I think what's emerged is, for a lot of people in Africa, their biggest resilience strategy is livestock. So I think what would be interesting is we need to also, in terms of tech, is start and have a look at the bank. You know, what determines a bank? How do you trade in a way which maybe like livestock doesn't put a huge pressure on the natural environment? Maybe there's some other clever ways, using cell phones and others to exchange between people, promote intercommunal trade, because I think that's the other thing, is that COVID has shown us you need to go local.
It's interesting that you say that livestock is sort of the main form of resilience, because we really experience that in some of our project areas. These technological solutions are really, really important. And I think that they need to be linked with very practical solutions, like linking people to markets and making sure that people can get a fair market value for the produce that they produce. I think that you can't have one without the other.
Growing of cattle in a way that regenerates the land through proper land management, you're going to get healthier cattle, healthier environments, and as you said, healthier people. Natural environment with these high-tech solutions with the market.
Steve sort of took the words out of my mouth there. I wanted to say it's also important from the production side of things. So how do we regenerate using these cattle? And I think another thing that I also maybe didn't mention was we're actually working on rangeland monitoring, where we actually use satellite imagery to see what grass is there, which cattle should be grazing there, and then we would then divide the different sections of the land. And then how this would work is using satellite imagery, we can tell what grass is on there. Is it ready to be, or cattle then come and graze on there? And then we would then send the farmer an SMS as like a collective group of farmers to say, okay, next month you should be the cattle should be eating from A and leave B to regenerate, and C, and so on and so on and so on. And through that as well, we've also been trying to do measuring the carbon that's in the soil to see how effective it is. So yeah, I think I definitely agree with Steve when he says it has to work all the way through, from production all the way to linking to the market.
Brilliant, brilliant. And I'm sure Peter has things to say about carbon markets, being that some of the work that you're doing, Peter, is generating carbon credits, and you're getting paid for it. So I think it's important. It's an important view to say it's not just theoretical anymore. You can actually get money from this. Peter, I'll give you an opportunity to say something about carbon market.
In the carbon world, people talk about cows, and methane. But we look at it from the other way around as well. If you have so many cows, means there's a lot of cow dung, and lots of cow dung means lots of fuel for biogas, generators, which can power these cold storage systems that are needed, to have your meat cold stored at source, and and then powering your electric refrigerated trucks that can move the processed meat or milk to the final market. So that's one of the interesting things on that side, which links directly into carbon credits, because you find that with more production being localized now, by figuring out how to reduce the carbon footprint, inverse it even if need be, it becomes very interesting there, because you find in whether they're sold as VRs, or whether they're sold directly through carbon trading platforms or directly to larger entities. Carbon credits are valuable, and sometimes the projects similar to what you've been talking about, with kind of regenerative agriculture, involving livestock and so on. There's one project in Scotland, actually, on the REN platform, where the carbon credits are valued at $32 a ton, which is incredible. But that's because of the value of bringing everything together, with livestock there, roaming in the right places, nutrients going back into the soil, and then having agroforestry at the same time. So when such projects are being run, and when the carbon footprint is tracked and reduced, it can actually become a very interesting income stream as tourism goes off. Very interesting in an income stream, to add another layer of resilience, to the value of the livestock.
That's amazing. Thank you for that, Peter. And I think it's important that you mentioned those figures. Some of the conversations that I'm always engaged in around sustainability still, I think, approach the issue of carbon markets from a very theoretical point of view. And I know one of your projects is getting returns from being involved in carbon trading. So thanks for that perspective. Nonsi, I think as we shift gears to kind of wrap up, thanks to the panelists for making time for this conversation. So back to you, Nonsi. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. And I think as Africans, we always make a plan, no matter what it is. If there's no electricity, if there's no water, we always make a plan. So whatever comes our way, I think would be able to make a plan. So I think, thank you again, as Mo was saying, thank you to everybody for joining. I think we've had a really good conversation, and we've even had to put a stop to it. It would have been nice to go on. But yeah, thank you guys for joining, and hopefully we'll see you guys again soon.